Good afternoon. I am Nicole Pillay, and this is the art of UX writing at UX South Africa 2020. So today I'm going to be speaking about a lot of things. At the end of my talk, I'm hoping that you will have an understanding of how to ask the right questions to plan your content. You will definitely have access to a one-pager, a checklist, my tools and guides. I will touch on at the end how to test and develop content, and yeah, that's what you'll learn. I will explain how the UX writing process fits into the design process as well. So hopefully this is useful for you. So writing microcopy and interface copy means that I take complex tasks and I summarize them into one line or 22 characters. That's not a joke. That's actually real. I am forced to write complex tasks and complex things in 22 characters, usually a toast or a header. Actually headers are 10 characters, but that's a discussion for another day. It also means that I find the best way to communicate to someone using software on their app. I am usually constrained, and my work is usually constrained by space and the limitations in the technology. This is 4-year-old me. My mom says I came out the womb talking, which makes sense because I do run my mouth quite a lot, and I think I was a born natural storyteller. So I was born telling stories, mostly embellishing them to get the attention of the adults and of my cousins, because I was the younger one and I needed to do something to get their attention. On the left of your screen is my maternal grandmother, and on the right is my mom. These two women single-handedly cultivated the storytelling part of me. It started with these two women. My grandmother would tell me stories of a monkey named Benji who lived in the mountainous areas of KZN, and every time we drove from Pietermaritzburg to Durban, we would always stop at this foresty area, and she would tell me stories about this monkey that she made up, obviously. And before bed she would ask me to tell her stories about Benji, and I think that pushed my imagination as a young child. My mom made sure I was always reading as a teenager and forced me to play Scrabble, which I absolutely hated. Now it's actually one of my favorite board games. And those are the roots of my skills and where my love for words began. Now I write as little as possible. I know, right? Like interface copy is literally as little as possible. How confusing. So UX writing is an iterative process, just as life is. We learn and we iterate to be better versions of ourselves. It's also a very collaborative role because my words can't be used without business requirements, without business speaking to design, and without design creating wireframes, without those wireframes being given to a developer to build a product. Which brings us to the fun stuff, and I hope you guys had a very well-balanced lunch, because I'm going to need your full brain capacity because I'm about to saturate you with information. This is the software life cycle. It's an outline of the software development life cycle. I'm going to speak about the most niche role in the cycle, but also the most niche role in design itself. And I currently work in Standard Bank and in the experience design arm of Standard Bank. And I work with designers, I work with tech leads, I work with product owners, I work with product designers, UI designers, UX designers, and I'm the only writer, or at least the only advocate for words there. So design forms a very small part of the entire software development lifecycle, as you can see. And what UX writing is, and microcopy and conversation design is a very, very small part of the design process. This is the ideal UX writing process. It's my ideal UX writing process. One I wish I had time to do for every single feature and every single product, but that's not how it goes. This is how it goes. It's usually a quick chat, some words, and this is what the process actually looks like in practice. Today, I'd like to unlock your ability to write short form. I'm not saying you're a writer. I'm saying with the right set of skills and the tools, you can unlock a little bit of the writer within you. Some people naturally gravitate towards writing, and they don't find it as daunting as others. And I'll add a link to a folder to my G Drive with all the resources and the tools that I will speak about today. These are some of the questions that I ask when I'm first briefed on a project. It's usually the problem statement that is defined by the product owner or the stakeholders, and the goal is important because it is the reason for the work. It is the reason we do what we do. What the user is doing is necessary. It's the end goal for the user. Are they applying for a credit card? Do they need finance, car finance? Are they applying for a home loan? This is what the user is doing. And that's the goal that they need to complete. It's the definition of what the user is doing and why they're interacting with your software. I'll go into more detail about where, how, and what shortly, as these questions need quite a deep dive. How much space do you have? I mean, how much space allows you to understand how much you can write? If you have, as I mentioned before, 22 characters, you really, really cannot write that much. If you have an entire screen, if you have 50 characters on one line, you have more room to play. That's the nature of microcopy. I'll go into more detail a bit later on that, but the component question is so that you know from a hierarchy perspective how to plan your content. So let's jump right into it. Understanding your user and what they are doing. Are they buying airtime? That's a day-to-day task, something the user will do every day. They'll log onto your app and buy airtime every day or at least 3 times a week. This type of task needs the simplest, least amount of copy on the screen. This is helpful in tone, it's quick pieces of copy, and it has the least barriers to entry. If you have an opportunity to write a conversation for an airtime purchase, for example, you should. You should write a conversation for any flow or any feature that you're working on. And it's simple. It's as simple as writing a chatbot script or writing a normal script. And writing out the conversation helps with natural language. So here's a quick conversation I wrote going back to our buying airtime flow. This is a conversation between you and a user, and it's the simplest way to understand what you might need from the user. It also helps with the design process, and it makes the experience, it makes designing much quicker. Unique journeys are more conversational and require a lot more time. Applying for a home loan, for example, is a unique journey. It isn't completed every day, and that unique journey will need more conversation. Your tone will be different. Creating a simple conversation will help you create shorter, more effective narratives later on. Understanding your user's needs. Where are they completing this task or accessing this information from? And that is based on the platform. Is it web, desktop, or app, or web mobile? Determining which platform is being used helps me understand how to communicate with the user. If I have the luxury of writing 2 sets of copy based on the platform, I definitely will. However, responsive copy is always best. If you write for the smaller screen size and scale, You only need to write once and it will fit on all your screen sizes. Write for mobile and it works everywhere else. If I know the platform, I can determine their general state of being. This is the user. If the task is being completed on an app, the user is more likely to be in a rush and have no time. That means I can't be conversational. I don't have the luxury of speaking to the user for a long time or making their airtime purchase conversational. This is the emotional state of the user. And the emotional state of the user is very, very important when writing copy. You need to understand their emotions during the task. You need to understand it before they start the task and after they've completed the task. There are different stages a user experiences while interacting with the feature or a product. How are they feeling about what they're doing? Will help you mitigate the risk of making the user feel more unsure than they already do if you know how they feel beforehand. The tone of your copy is directly correlated with the feelings of your user. I always say that the voice of a brand remains the same, but it's the tone that changes depending on the feature, the project, the flow, or the task. And user sentiment is a very important aspect of giving the user the right words at the right time. To understand or try and figure out what a user is thinking is very, very tough. It's very tough to determine without engaging with the user what they're thinking, but can be easier if you've asked all the previous questions. UX writers are the advocates for the user. They are the voice of the user, their emotions of the user. And usually a UX writer's empathy score is quite high. Now let's cue very hard conversations with devs or product owners or business owners who only have the requirements in mind and are only concerned about how they can get this particular feature out as fast as possible. And I'm there arguing about how the user feels and what they're thinking at that time. And they usually laugh at me, but then they understand exactly why I'm saying that, because I don't want to give my user something that they don't need at that point in time. I also need to be very sympathetic and empathetic of their position and what they're experiencing, and to make their whole experience easier as I write something. So your user has questions about what they are doing, and your copy needs to answer those questions before they are asked. This is why user research is so important, and we can't make assumptions when writing copy, because we only think of the questions we might have. We have no idea how the user feels unless we talk to them. And if you don't have access to your users, you need to triangulate your copy or your designs with people outside of the project team. And a user doesn't have a lot of questions when buying airtime, but they might have a lot of questions when they're reversing a debit order, or when they're applying for a credit card, or when they're doing any of the unique journeys that I mentioned earlier on. So if you understand what your user is thinking, how they feel, you will be able to determine the copy that is needed, as well as the tone of voice needed to reassure and answer the user's questions. So I just like to circle back on user sentiment, as it speaks directly to choosing actionable words and crafting narratives. Here are 3 potential flows or journeys a user would encounter. As mentioned, there's resetting your password, buying a pair of shoes, opening a savings account. And on the right is how the user feels while they're doing all that. Some of these journeys are unique journeys, and some of them are day-to-day journeys. Let's take resetting your password. What would you say the antonym is for frustrated? If a user is feeling frustrated, our copy needs to encourage the user. The copy you write needs to uplift the user, to reassure them that what they're doing is going to be easy, that what they're doing isn't risky, it's quite secure, that you've created a secure space for the user. So what would be reassuring to someone trying to reset a password? Maybe if we tell them how long it will take, or we let them know that it's secure, as I mentioned, or safe, and maybe what documents or info they might need on hand while doing this process. So I went into a little bit of detail on the reset password scenario. And writing effective narratives means you need to know what information the user needs at different points in the journey, like I mentioned. So our user here is trying to reset their password. What information do they need up front? So I've laid out the sign-in page. You could have a reset button on the sign-in page. What information do they need up front? So at Standard Bank, you need to have your card, the card that you open the account with. You need to have the card that you open the account with and your ATM PIN in order to do the reset. That is information that you should be on the first screen before a user initiates the process. And that will save an already frustrated user time because they know what they need from the start. So let's look at how I've laid out the content here, and I'll give you some detail on my understanding of what I've put down. On the sign-in page, you could have a button to reset, or you could have a secondary link asking the user if they have forgotten their password. This is very important because resetting your password is a common occurrence, or forgetting your password is a common occurrence. So it's something that you might have on the sign-in screen. Your main reset page should have all the information the user needs, like a card or access to their email that was used. So you'd write copy that says, in order to reset your password, you will need to have access to the email address used to create this profile. Or in order to reset your password, you will need to have your ID or your bank card. You need to tell them this information up front before they get further down into this process, before they get further in terms of screens. 9 screens later, a user is not going to go back because you didn't tell them up front what they needed to complete the process. Then security step. So a form of security related to what you ask them to have on hand in the reset page. Confirmation of the change and a way for them to sign in again. That's really important. So you have to tell them that what they did was successful. You can leave them on the confirmation page and they could navigate back to the sign-in screen, but you could take them there too, and that would be a better user experience because now they can sign in. You've put them back at the place where they wanted to sign in with their updated details. You could have a toast that says password reset successful. Follow through with things that the user has done already. So testing content that is written in concept design or wireframe is very important, and I'll take you through a few ways I test content and the tools that I currently use. Writing real UX copy from the start. So you need to involve testing copy in UX research processes as soon as possible. So if you're in a team, if you're the only UX writer, if you're the only UX designer and you do not have a UX writer or you do not have anyone else assisting you, it's very important to test your copy at the same time that you're testing your designs. That means writing real copy and letting go of lorem ipsum. Please, can we let go of lorem ipsum? It's time. Lorem ipsum needs to die. Using the planning grid and the conversation design tips that I've spoken about, you should be able to tackle it. You should be able to test your own copy, and you should be able to write your own copy. And working with full copy not only uncovers mistakes early, but helps to plan the design solution. So showing the copy in context. This is very important because putting copy in the design when testing, unless you're running word association tests, is important because you don't want to put a burden on your user to imagine the design, to look at the copy you're testing with no design and assume or imagine where this copy goes into what process and how it looks in the design. And context is important to collect the most accurate data. So if you put your copy in context on a design, it will be easier for you to gather data that way than if you just test your copy on its own. And that takes us to recruiting and observing. So you need to recruit users that represent your actual target audience. If you do not recruit users, you will get skewed data. You will be testing your designs and your copy on an audience that isn't your target audience, and that will skew your data. Also observing, now I know it's COVID and we aren't able to have face-to-face tests with anyone, and I will speak about tools a little later on that you can use to test your copy during these times. But when we are out of this and when you do get the chance to test with actual users, observing nonverbal cues while the user is reading the copy is very important, because users' behavior sometimes contradicts what they're saying. And sometimes they will say, this is great and I understand it, but their body language is saying they don't. And they're awkwardly hunching over and squinting, and they're navigating incorrectly because they missed the button you put there that said next. So watching the behavior of the user is very important, and the nonverbal cues is extremely important. And that takes us to all the tools and everything I have on my Google Drive that I will send the link for, and you guys will be able to access it and download any of the documents. The content planning grid is there that I presented earlier. And let's go straight into Google Trends, is one of my favorites. So Google Trends, as you can see here, I've just searched the presidents of 3 different countries, and you can see the search trends, web search trends in South Africa for the past 12 months in the news category. You can change that. So there are different searches you can do: association searches, comparison searches. You can test 3 different words or terms or phrases or complex terms like biometrics, for example, with different terms like fingerprint and iris. And you can test those terms to see the trends and understanding of users. I did that recently, and I took this, I exported it, and I put it in a presentation to my business stakeholders to explain to them why we could not use a specific word, because nobody really knew what that word was or was researching or even understood that term. And Google Trends helps with that, and it's great. This is an old faithful, Grammarly. I'm sure everyone uses Grammarly. If you don't use Grammarly already, please add Grammarly to as a plugin, and it will pick up all your spelling errors. It does edit your content in American English, and if you're writing in British English, you might need to change that setting, but it is amazing. Obviously, as you can see, I don't have the premium version, but I would suggest you get the premium version because it's really great. Hemingway App, also another old faithful. Everyone loves this one. Hemingway tells you the readability of the content that you have written. You can test long form or short form. I test words on Hemingway. I'll put a word in that is a complex word, like, as you can see, utilize, for example. I'll put that in, and it will tell me the readability of that particular word. And literacy level of your user is very important when you're writing copy, because you do not want to write complex copy that a user is not going to understand. So testing words in Hemingway to see how complex they are will help you provide easier copy in your design. This is WebFX, which is very similar to Hemingway, except that you can actually test an entire URL. You can place your URL in the field, and it will read your entire site and tell you which parts of your site has heavy copy, which part of your site have copy that is very difficult to read for someone with complex sentences. I love WebFX, and it's a great tool for direct input as well. You can type something out similar to the way you would in Hemingway or in Grammarly, and it's just more direct. You can export as well from WebFX. Then I have spell check plugin for Sketch. If you're a designer and you have Sketch, if you're using Sketch, I strongly suggest you get the spell check plugin for Sketch, because it will scan through all your wireframes and all your designs and make sure you don't present, if you don't have a writer, or if you don't have time to run your concepts through a writer at that time, you can get this plugin and it will scan through all your designs and you won't present anything with spelling errors. Then I would like to talk about Usability Hub, which we use to test content. It is amazing. There are free versions of Usability Hub. You can do navigation testing. You can do sitemap testing. You can load your designs in and ask a question, and it brings back heat maps to tell you where users clicked when they were going through something. So Usability Hub is great. So is Google Forms. If you're looking for specific testing on UX copy, you can use something called a close test, close with a Z. This is quite an extensive test. You remove some words from a piece of text and the user, or you get somebody to complete it so you get an understanding of whether they understand the concept that you're trying to communicate. I also use optimal sort and card sort right now, card with a K, for association and word association testing, and card association, card sorting, because we are not in front of our users at the moment, so you can use that. First click is also great. And I think that is a wrap. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving me your time today and listening to my talk. I hope it was useful. I hope you learned a lot, and I will definitely be posting the link for my Google Drive and for you to download all the documents, and I look forward to all your questions in the Q&A.
Thank you for that absolutely awesome and knowledgeful talk. It was absolutely crazy. Thank you for all the tools. Yeah, the chat was boosting. So we have a few questions.
Ooh, I'm excited for questions.
First question: What is your opinion of the approach of writing out the conversation and using that to define the flow and wireframes instead of writing to fit a predefined flow or screens?
Okay, so you can, writers are supposed to be as versatile as possible, and that means that there are times when a designer comes to me with the flow or the screens already done, and I need to retrofit the content for the screens that have already been created. However, I believe that conversation design and content first design approach is really useful and helpful to mitigate a myriad of things that could potentially happen while designing this piece of software. So in my opinion, I think content first design approach is really good and the way forward, because if you design the conversation first and you have all the conversation written out, the design can actually lead from the conversation and not the other way around. But I mean, I feel like as in South Africa, we're still light years away from content first design and that approach, and it will take time to get there.
Thank you so much for that. So next question, and this is by Cara. Our legacy software's error messages has been described as condescending and are often so vague that it ends up as a support ticket. Are there any best practice tips for how to write error messages?
Yes. So in the Google Drive link that I shared, there is an entire document for generic messaging. So you can take some of the generic messaging that I've previously written and use some of that. But I would suggest structure for messaging would be to explain what the problem is and then provide a solution. If you're doing a single line message, you don't have many characters to do that. I would suggest multi-line messaging. And then if you can speak to a developer to change the amount of time that the message is on the screen. So if you're doing a multi-line message, it stays on the screen for longer so the user gets a chance to read it properly. Yeah, that's what I would say. I would say definitely the problem. So if it's like something wrong with their card linking or something, you tell them there is something wrong with your card linking, or we couldn't link your card at this time. Please try again. You have to provide a solution. That's how you should structure messaging.
Okay, thank you. So let's check. We've got one.
Everyone's having an issue with lag on the video.
Let me just check the comments. I'm not sure. I mean, if it's the connection or if it's your connection, if it's just
Probably.
general.
Yeah.
Can I maybe ask everyone if we could just stick it out for the last question and let's jump into the next session after this. If it's still an issue, then we could maybe address it. And I think just as Jacob also suggested, you can also reduce the quality of your video. That reduces the lag.
I just did, yeah.
So last question. What is your advice for designers who want to work more effectively with their content writers? How do you create a good partnership from early on?
So a few things. Firstly, I would say involve your writer from the beginning. So when your stakeholders brief you on a business requirement, I would suggest involving your writer from the beginning, from conception, from inception. As soon as you know what you're working on, that's when you should involve a writer so you guys can talk about it, firstly. Secondly, I would say trust. Trust is really, really important when working with a writer. And I know personally, working with stakeholders and working with a lot of the design community itself, the only way that they trust you to write copy for them is if you've done it before many times, and your writer is also wants to be as involved in the design process as you as the designer are. So I would suggest involving your writer as soon as possible and getting their thoughts on what they think the conversation could be for that particular piece of work.
Thank you. So that is the last question. Guys, if there are any more questions, please reach out to Nicole. I think, Nicole, you're still with us for the rest of the day.
Yes, I am.
And if you do want to reach out to Nicole, I mean, she's not on Twitter. She is on LinkedIn. And also you can chat about all those other things, the bodyboarding and the tequila stuff and the music and everything else. So thank you so much, Nicole, again, for the awesome talk. Thank you, everybody, for the engagement.